The Grand Slam Committee is meeting in London this week to vote on a number of proposed rule changes. Here are the three notables. 1, enforcing the time between points with the implementation of a shot clock. A similar clock was used this year at the US Open in qualies, as well as at the ATP Next Gen Finals in Milan. 2, a reduction in seeds at the Slams from 32 to 16. This would protect fewer players from tough early round matchups, making the draw infinitely more wide open with more competitive matches in early rounds. And 3, in-match coaching on court. This is a rule that's been in place for all WTA events since 2008, but has yet to be introduced to the Grand Slam tournaments. So, if you could pick one rule change out of these three, which would you choose? That's this week's Tough Call. Thank you, Brett. So some interesting choices on the table for this week's Tough Call. Let's recap the three possible rule changes, and then these guys will tell us which one they think is a good idea. Number 1 is the shot clock. They would keep the players to 25 seconds. They tried it in qualies at the US Open last year, and it was a reasonable success. Number 2, the reduction in seeds from 32 back to 16. And number 3, the use of on-court coaching for both the men and women, something the women have had at tour level for a while now. Jim, why don't you start? Which one do you like?
There are two pieces to that first rule that I really like. One is the serve clock, which gives players an awareness of where they stand so they know exactly how much time they have in between points. But I'm even more excited about 25 seconds at the majors instead of 20. That makes so much sense. It's never made any sense to have less time when you're playing a more physical match in the men's game, at least at best of 5 versus 25 seconds at a normal tour event where you're playing best of 3. So for me, I think that's a no-brainer. Just check the boxes and let's get moving on it for the Australian Open.
For what it's worth, they tracked it at the US Open in qualies this year to see how it went. There were 17,000 points played, give or less, in qualies, and only 9 violations on the serve clock. Mm-hmm. That would seem to suggest, right, that it worked?
Yeah, I think it's just monitoring it again, clicking it at the right time. But the more important, I think even the more important thing is the fact that, it's actually pretty logical. You go to 25 seconds in the 3 out of 5 set matches, in particular for the men.
It'll never, if you say it's logical, it'll never happen.
But you raised a really important question, which is when do you start the clock, and do you give the chair umpire the discretion to, if it's a long point, to maybe pause a little before he hits it?
I think it just needs to be clear. Whatever it is, the chair umpires have to have a clear path of what they're supposed to do and how they do it. To me, points over, call the score, clock starts.
So no discretion?
No, I think the discretion is when do you call the score. So when you play a really long point, especially on the show courts with lots of fan participation, they're cheering. The chair umpire waits to call the score until the crowd comes down. On the outside courts, that'll be less impactful, but that's where they have the discretion to give players an extra breather if they've had a real physical point, and that makes sense.
I think that's a great point, and people who object to the time rule being enforced the way it is, even now without a shot clock in existence, generally say, and I think I've heard both of you say this at various times, that the enforcement seems to be arbitrary and irregular, and that some chair umpires in some situations call it all the time, others wait until a critical moment in the match. How do we get, other than having a shot clock, a more uniform interpretation of the rule?
I think this is the answer. I think this is so obvious, and it was so successful at the US Open and qualies. I believe this will be accepted immediately. I think by Australia, I'm hopeful. If calm heads prevail, this makes total sense.
All right.
You're confounded by that answer?
No, I'm not. I think it's perfectly reasonable. I just wonder if we're ever going to get to a situation where somebody's ball bouncing and the crowd starts to go 5, 4, 3.
Yeah, but maybe the more interesting question is, do they have the scoreboards for this at all the majors too? Because you have to have the digital scoreboards. I think they do in Australia. I'm not sure about in Paris. We'll see. We'll have to make adjustments.
Let me ask you about one of the other rule suggestions, and that's on-court coaching. We saw that in the US Open qualies as well. We saw it at the Next Gen Finals in Milan. You guys have both been on record as saying that even though the women have had it, and you did it when you were coaching Sloane, you don't really think this belongs in tennis.
No, I'm a little bit torn because I understand what's trying to happen. Number one, I don't know how to do it the right way. I've seen it not me as a coach. You're laughing because you thought I meant
thought
me
you meant
because I
you,
can't coach. Yeah. I don't know how the rules should be executed the right way. I don't know how to, the way it's done right now in the WTA, I don't like that coming down the court. I saw the next gen with the headsets. That's interesting, but it's a little bit antiquated, but here's my belief is one of the most amazing things about tennis, it's an individual sport. You have to figure it out when you're out there. That needs to be celebrated more. And part of the job, I think, of the coach is to help the player learn how to do that, learn how to problem solve under duress, because that's kind of the makeup of what individual sports mean. So I would like to see that celebrated. And the bottom line is I prefer to keep it that way.
I think it's one of the big differentiators in tennis versus other sports is that the players have to solve things for themselves. In golf, you have a caddy who can help you. In most sports, you can call timeouts and talk to your coach or your teammates. In tennis and singles, it's you and you alone. I'm not someone who is opposed to change at all. If we needed to change the scoring system because the fans are no longer coming out, by all means, let's do it. This scenario for me is a little bit more vital to the integrity of the sport. Yeah. But if it works and people love it, great, and I would be for that. But what I have not seen is people responding to what happens in the WTA going, hey, this is a better product. And I think there's also a fundamental difference in the quality of coaching that the top players can afford versus the other coaches. That's another problem. And lastly, I think it's not fair to give away your coaching advice because we're mic'd up when we do this in the WTA, and every team out there, every coach and player should be, if they're not already, looking at what the opposition is saying against them. I just feel like that's kind of ridiculous.
I'll just say one thing. If the WTA decides to keep their rule, I like the headset idea better than the coach coming down. I think the optics of, in 95% of the time, a male coach kneeling down in front of a female player and telling her what to do is just bad optics for women's sports. It doesn't do the sport a favor. I hope
there were two things, right, Brett? There was one, the headset like that, and two was only at the end of the set. Yeah. So it's not like a call for help, which is what it sometimes comes off as opposed to, hey, let's get some instructions here. So you don't break up the momentum of the match in the same way. It's just a different vibe altogether.
All right, let's talk about the third proposed rule change, the seeds. Thinking about bringing them back from 32 down to 16. They used to be 16. Obviously, the thought here is to protect fewer players, get more competitive matches earlier in tournaments. What do you guys think?
Well, if you're talking from a player perspective, you're going to love the 32 seeds because everyone wants to be protected. I, for one, love 16 seeds. I would like to see a little bit more possibility, a little bit more variation about what could happen. I mean, look, they're all world-class players these days. I miss kind of some of the crazy. Look, I was part of it. One year I was one of the next players to be seeded at the U.S. Open. I played McEnroe first round. And so that's not great, but it makes for a little bit more added value, gives you a little bit more pizzazz, and I like the variation that it creates.
McEnroe definitely would have preferred that you were seeded that year because you beat him.
That one time.
Well, okay, well, you did.
I like 16 seeds. I understand why it was brought in the 32 seeds. It was largely a play for television to protect the weekends for people like CBS who didn't cover the tournament at the U.S. Open during the week, and they wanted to make sure the top seeds were around for the weekend. I get that, but now we're in a different television environment where we're covering everything first ball to last in a much different way than the old days. So I think that it's more exciting to have some of those matchups you're talking about early in the tournament.
Remember the term dangerous floater? I feel like that's gone away in the era of 32 seeds. How dangerous is the 33 guy?
Unless it's Ivo Karlovic, typically not as dangerous as you think.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so to recap, Jim is supporting the invocation of the shot clock. Paul wants to see us drop from 32 to 16 seeds. We'll see what the ITF does, and we invite you to join the conversation. Let us know what you think. Post on any of the Tennis Channel social media platforms using the hashtag #ToughCall, and we'll get some results and your opinions later in the week on TC Live.